Okay, so we've looked at actus reus. Now we're going to move on to mens rea, and we're going to look at a number of videos which take apart all of the different elements of mens rea. And this video is going to focus on the difference between direct and indirect intention, the two most culpable forms of mens rea. And let's start by going back to our liability equation. If you remember, we said that the liability, criminal liability, is constructed by looking at whether the defendant has completed the actus reus, and as a result of that, if they have, do they have mens rea, or strict, if the case is one of strict liability, is the case one of strict liability, and the absence of a defence. We'll talk about defence in different videos. So let's just stick for actus reus plus mens rea equals criminal liability. And the mens rea element, of course, means guilty mind. So does the defendant have the guilty mind? Does he mean to do what it is that actually happens? And mens rea can be the distinguishing part of some crimes. So if we take, for instance, what do I mean by that? If we take section 18 and section 20 GBH, the actus reus is the same. The actus reus is grievous bodily harm or wounding. Yet the difference between section 18 and section 20 is a mens rea element. So what makes something a section 18 as opposed to making it a section 20 is a mens rea element. So it can be the distinguishing part of some crimes. And we also have to be very, very careful to distinguish mens rea between distinguish it from motive. Motive means a reason. Why did the defendant do what they did? Whereas mens rea means, did the defendant have the guilty mind? Did they mean to do what they did? Not the reason. So be very careful when you are writing about mens rea and don't use the word motive. Don't get the two mixed up. And we're going to focus on two main elements of mens rea. There are more, but we're going to focus on two main ones. The first is intention itself, and the second is recklessness. And I'll deal with recklessness in a separate video. Intention can be split up into direct or indirect intention. And it's these two that we're going to focus on in this video. What is direct and what is indirect intention? And we'll deal with the others in different videos. So let's start by looking at this difference between direct and indirect intention then. And let me draw you a scenario. The scenario is that the defendant owns a block of flats, or he owns a flat, and he can get a better offer from the people that are already in there. So he wants to scare the people that are already in there, so as they leave and move, and he can then re-let the flat at a much higher rate. In order to get them to do that, he pushes some lighted paper through the letterbox. His intention is to scare the occupiers so that they move out. That's his intention. That's what he means to do. That's what he wants to do. A fire, so let's look at the two outcomes of that. A fire starts in the flat. The occupiers become scared and they move out. He has achieved his aim. His aim was to scare them so that they moved out. And that's exactly what happened. They moved out. So therefore he can be said to have had direct intent. He wanted to scare them. He wanted them to move out. They were scared. They moved out. He achieved what he set out to do. He has direct intent. An indirect intent can be illustrated with the second scenario, which is that the occupier's child dies as a result of the fire that the defendant starts. This then becomes an indirect intention. It is not what he directly intended, because what he directly intended was that they should be scared and move out. But what happens is the child dies, and the child dying becomes an indirect intent. And what we're going to do is to look at the rules that separate direct intent from indirect intent. So let's start with direct intent. And direct intent is the most culpable. And by most culpable, we mean the most blameworthy. Sorry, let me finish that. The most culpable. So if we have a spectrum, we've got direct intention, oblique intention, recklessness, and then down this end we can have strict liability. They're not the only ones, but the ones that are most culpable are at this end of the scale. A direct intention is at this end of the scale. It is more blameworthy to cause deliberate harm than it is to do so carelessly, which would be recklessness. So it's more blameworthy to be direct, to have direct intent, than it is to be careless. And we're going to correspond the everyday meaning of intention, and that is a person who has caused death or who wants to cause death as his aim, his purpose or his goal, has direct intention to kill. That seems relatively straightforward. And most of the cases that you will look at will be straightforward direct intention. And our definition for direct intention comes from the case of R.V. Mohan. And in Mohan, a police officer on duty sees Mr. Mohan speeding towards him. He steps in the road to ask Mr. Mohan to stop. Mr. Mohan slows down, and when he's about 10 yards from the police officer, he speeds up, causing the police officer to have to jump out of the way to protect himself. And the issue about intention came up. And the court decided, and I'm not going to write this down because it would take too long, but the court decided that direct intention as defined in Mohan means a decision to bring about, so far as it lies in the defendant's powers, the commission of an offence, no matter whether the defendant desired the consequences of his act or not. So direct intention is about wanting to carry out the act and not about the result. So direct intention is about wanting to carry out the act and not the result. Straightforward, and that will encompass the majority of cases that you'll look at. However, we have a problem, and our problem is this. Imagine this scenario. The defendant wants to destroy a package, a very valuable package. I can't draw a bow on it. It's meant to be a package with a bow on it, on a plane. And in order to do that, what he does is he plants a bomb on the plane. His intention is to blow up the package so that he can collect the insurance. What would we charge him with if he planted the bomb, timed to go off in mid-flight, with the intention of blowing up the package, if all we had was direct intent? Because if all we had was direct intent, we have the actus reus, and let's say 100 people die on board. So 100 die. The actus reus of murder, people die. But the mens rea of murder, which is the intention to cause death or grievous bodily harm, we don't have, because his intention is to blow up the package. We cannot have a situation in which somebody blows up a plane, yet cannot be found liable for their murders because he doesn't have the mens rea. And this is the problem that the courts have. The courts needed to form a definition of indirect intent because of this type of scenario. We need to widen the net to catch most murder subjects, but produce a definition narrow enough so as to reserve liability, for murder that is, to only the most serious cases. So we have a balancing act. We have a balancing act of widening the net, yet maintaining some narrowness. And because that is so difficult, it's so difficult to do, the courts have seen a number of cases change their definition of indirect intent. I will do a separate video that looks precisely at all of those cases and the development of the law on indirect or oblique intent. But for now, I'm just going to stick on 3 main cases because the matter has largely been resolved. And it's largely been resolved through these 3 cases: Nedrick, Woolin and Matthews and Elaine. And for my students, I want you to concentrate on these 3 cases when you discuss the issues of oblique intent. We'll start with Nedrick in 1986. In Nedrick, the defendant pours paraffin through the letterbox of a house and set it alight. It's the house of his ex-girlfriend. And it results in the death of a child. And in that case, the court said that if, as a result of the defendant's acts, the outcome was virtually certain, and the defendant knew that it was likely to be virtually certain, then we can draw an intent from his actions. So what that means is pouring paraffin into the letterbox of a house and setting it alight. It is virtually certain that the house will catch fire. It is virtually certain that if there are people inside, that those people will die. Because of that element of virtual certainty, Nedrick is liable for the death of the child. This case is then confirmed in Woolin, and Woolin has an interesting history, as I said, and I won't go into it because I'll do so on a separate video. But in Woolin, the key issue is the defendant loses his temper with his 3-month-old son and throws the child onto a hard surface, it's a wall, causing head injuries to the child, and the child dies. Once again, the court used this premise of, virtual certainty. The court uses the premise of virtual certainty. And in effect it says, if the jury felt that death or serious bodily harm was virtually certain, then they had the right to draw an inference of direct or indirect intention, meaning that Mr. Woolin was guilty. Now, in 2003, this has been largely affirmed by the case of Matthews and Elaine. And the two defendants appealed against their conviction for murder following the death of a young man who couldn't swim, whom they had thrown from a bridge into a river. And the Court of Appeal affirmed the conviction, because it was on appeal, and affirmed the decision in Woolin. Now, it does have some difficulties because they said that a defendant's foresight of virtual certainty does not automatically require the jury to find that he intended that result. It's merely evidence, although very, very strong evidence, from which the jury may draw that conclusion. So they've eased back a little bit, but nevertheless, the virtual certain test remains. Okay, so let's just sum up very, very quickly. Direct and indirect intention form the most culpable parts of mens rea. And the difference is that direct intent is this notion that the defendant meant to do what he did, essentially. Indirect intent is where we find liability, we find an intention, even though what the defendant did, what the act he carried out, his desired intention, was not and was different from the actual outcome, providing that the actual outcome is a virtual certainty of his actions.